The year was 1095, and Europe stood on the edge of a great transformation. Villages and kingdoms stretched across the continent, bound together by faith, yet often torn apart by war. Castles dotted the hills, monasteries glowed with candlelight, and cathedrals rose slowly toward heaven. Life was hard, but within that hardship lay hope. Hope in God, hope in salvation, hope in something greater than the struggles of daily bread. It was in this world that a call rang out, a call that would echo across centuries. At the Council of Clermont in southern France, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd of nobles, knights, and common folk. His words, recorded and remembered in many ways, carried the force of thunder. He urged the Christians of Europe to march east, to take up arms, and to reclaim the holy city of Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The Pope spoke of suffering pilgrims, of holy places defiled, of a cause so sacred that it promised eternal reward. He called upon the knights, weary from fighting each other in endless feuds, to turn their swords instead against a common enemy. And he promised this: for all who took the cross, who sewed its red emblem upon their tunics and vowed to march to Jerusalem, their sins would be forgiven. Salvation was offered, not through cloisters or prayers alone, but through the clash of steel and the journey of war. Imagine that moment beneath the autumn sky. The crowd stirred, murmurs rose, and then voices swelled into a cry: Deus vult, Deus vult. God wills it, God wills it. It was said that men wept, women embraced their sons, and knights tore strips of cloth to fashion makeshift crosses, fastening them to their shoulders as signs of their vow. The air itself seemed to tremble with conviction, as though heaven had leaned close to listen. But why did the call fall upon such fertile ground? Europe of the late 11th century was a land of contrasts. On one hand, it was poor, its peasants bound to fields, its knights hungry for land and glory. On the other, it was deeply spiritual, every village marked by a church, every life shaped by the cycle of feast and fast. For many, the chance to march to the Holy Land was not only an escape from hardship, but a journey into meaning, a pilgrimage with a sword. Word spread swiftly. From France to Germany, from Italy to the distant Isles of England, people whispered of Jerusalem, the city where Christ had lived and died, now under the control of Muslim rulers. Pilgrimages had long been made there, but stories of danger and hardship reached the West, stoking fears and fanning zeal. The Pope's call gave these anxieties a focus, transforming devotion into a movement. The First Crusade had been born. Across Europe, nobles pledged their armies, peasants gathered what little they had, and clerics preached the holy cause from pulpits. Entire families sold their homes, convinced that the road to Jerusalem would lead them not only to salvation, but to a new life. Some were driven by pure devotion, others by hunger for wealth or land, others still by the hope of escape from debts or crimes. It was a vast tide of motives, all swept beneath the banner of the cross. In the castles of lords, sons of knights listened with burning eyes as bards sang of the crusade. In monasteries, scribes carefully recorded the Pope's words, ink flowing across parchment like prophecy. In villages, farmers knelt in prayer, wondering if they too should leave their ploughs and follow the call. The cross was not only stitched on tunics, but etched into hearts, as Europe turned toward the east with a fervor unmatched. The Byzantine Empire, centered at Constantinople, had been the spark for all this. Threatened by the advance of the Seljuk Turks, Emperor Alexios I had appealed to the West for aid. He sought mercenaries, disciplined knights who could help defend his borders. What he received was far greater: an entire movement, an army of faith unlike any seen before. One empire's cry for help became the seed of a holy war. And so, preparations began. Lords gathered supplies, smiths hammered swords and helmets, and priests blessed those who vowed to march. From every corner of Europe, roads filled with men and women bound for an uncertain destiny. Some would never reach the Holy Land, others would carve their names into legend. Picture the roads of France and Germany alive with pilgrims turned warriors, their packs heavy with provisions, their banners painted with the Red Cross. Children trailed behind wagons, mothers carried infants, priests sang hymns to steady, weary steps. In their minds, Jerusalem gleamed like a vision, a city of God waiting at the end of the long road. The Crusades were not born in a single moment, but in many hearts. They were shaped by longing, by poverty, by fear, by ambition. The Pope had lit the fire, but it was the people who carried it forward, each footstep echoing with a mix of faith and desperation. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the candlelit churches where vows were sworn. Knights kneel before altars, their armor gleaming in the flicker of flame. Priests trace the sign of the cross upon their foreheads, and the air is heavy with incense and prayer. Outside, horses snort impatiently, wagons creak beneath their loads, and the journey east begins. The First Crusade would carry them across mountains and rivers, through hunger and battle, through triumph and despair. It would lead them to Antioch, to Jerusalem, to blood and glory and ruin. But on that first night, after the Pope's call, none of that was yet known. All they felt was the fire of conviction, the certainty that they were chosen, that their steps were guided by the will of God. The call of the cross had been sounded, and the world would never be the same. The call of the cross had spread like fire across Europe. From grand castles to humble villages, men and women dreamed of Jerusalem, of holy battle, of eternal salvation. But the first to answer were not kings or great lords. They were ordinary people, peasants, laborers, beggars, and wanderers. They had no shining armor, no disciplined formations, only zeal and hope. Their story would be the first wave of the Crusades, remembered as the People's Crusade. At the heart of it was a man known as Peter the Hermit. He was a small, wiry figure, said to ride a donkey rather than a horse, dressed in rough robes, his eyes blazing with conviction. He wandered through towns and villages, preaching the Pope's call. His voice, though not noble or commanding, carried an irresistible fire. Crowds gathered around him, listening as he painted vivid images of Jerusalem waiting to be freed, of Christ himself urging them onward. They followed him by the thousands. Families left their fields and flocks, convinced that God would provide. Children clutched their mothers' hands, old men hobbled along with walking sticks, women carried baskets of food and the few possessions they owned. Their banners were crude, often just cloth dyed with crosses, yet they marched with the confidence of saints. They believed that miracles would guide their way, that rivers would part, that bread would fall from heaven. But faith, though strong, could not feed them. As the great tide of people moved eastward, hunger and disorder followed. Some pillaged villages for food, clashing even with fellow Christians along the way. In the towns of the Rhineland, tragedy struck. Mobs turned against Jewish communities, slaughtering them in misguided fury, believing they were striking the enemies of Christ. The violence foreshadowed the darker side of the crusading spirit, when zeal blurred into cruelty. Still, the mass of pilgrims pressed onward. They crossed into the lands of the Byzantine Empire, overwhelming the locals who struggled to feed and house them. Emperor Alexios, who had asked for disciplined knights, now looked out at ragged mobs pouring into his territory. To him, this was no army but a horde, and a dangerous one. He hurried them across the Bosporus, eager to send them into Asia Minor, far from his capital of Constantinople. Once in Anatolia, reality descended upon the People's Crusade. The Seljuk Turks, hardened warriors who ruled much of the land, did not see them as holy pilgrims, but as invaders. The peasants, poorly armed and without strategy, were no match for seasoned cavalry. At the town of Civito, the crusading mob was ambushed. Arrows rained down, swords flashed, and the pilgrims scattered in terror. Thousands were cut down where they stood, their crosses trampled into the dirt. The dream of Jerusalem ended in smoke and blood. Only a few survived, slipping back to Constantinople in shame and despair. The People's Crusade had begun with passion and ended in ruin, a tragic testament to what faith alone could not accomplish. Yet the story did not end there. Behind the peasants came the true armies of the First Crusade, knights in steel, disciplined warriors led by lords of renown. Men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse, and Hugh of Vermandois. They commanded armies of trained soldiers, cavalry that thundered across fields, and infantry hardened by battle. Unlike the peasants, they had wealth, supplies, and strategies. Their journey east was no less perilous. They crossed mountains and rivers, braving hunger, disease, and exhaustion. In Constantinople, the Emperor Alexios welcomed them cautiously, demanding oaths of loyalty before offering aid. Tensions simmered, for the Byzantines mistrusted the ambitions of these Western knights, fearing they sought to carve out lands for themselves rather than simply liberate Jerusalem. Still, the Crusaders pressed on, their columns stretched for miles, banners snapping in the wind, crosses gleaming on their shields. Along the way, some found allies among local Christians, while others seized what they needed by force. The road east was paved with both devotion and discord. Picture those roads now as nightfalls. Campfires flicker across the countryside, casting light on weary faces. Knights polish their swords, peasants mend torn boots, priests chant prayers that drift into the dark. The air is heavy with smoke and sweat, but also with anticipation. Ahead lies Antioch, Jerusalem, the Holy Land itself. Behind lies a Europe that had already begun to change, reshaped by the dream of the Crusade. The People's Crusade had shown the dangers of blind zeal, but it had also revealed the depth of longing that burned in the hearts of men and women. For those who survived, the journey continued, now under the banners of the great lords. The road to Jerusalem stretched on, winding through deserts, across rivers, and into battles that would test not only their strength but their faith. As you sink deeper into rest, imagine the silhouettes of those early pilgrims fading into the distance. Their hopes had been crushed, yet their march had set the stage. For soon the thunder of knights would echo across Anatolia, and the true test of the First Crusade was about to begin. The call of the cross had not been silenced. It was only gathering force. The ragged waves of the People's Crusade had been swept aside, but the true armies of Europe pressed on. They were knights, clad in steel, lords of renown with banners flying, and soldiers hardened by countless miles on foot. They had crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and marched through the lands of the Byzantine Empire, their faith and ambition burning like a flame that would not be quenched. Their first great challenge came at Antioch, a mighty city in northern Syria. Its walls were said to be unbreachable, its gates guarded by towers that loomed over the plain. When the Crusaders arrived, they saw not only the walls but also the task that lay ahead. To take Antioch would mean starvation, suffering, and siege, and so they dug trenches, built forts, and settled in for a long and merciless contest. The siege lasted months. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, disease crept through their camps, and men whispered of despair. Yet they held on, driven by the vision of Jerusalem that lay still further south. When at last a traitor opened a gate to them, the Crusaders surged into the city. Antioch fell to their swords, but their triumph was short-lived, for soon after, an army of Turks surrounded the city, and the Crusaders themselves became the besieged. It seemed as though all was lost, but in the depths of suffering, visions and relics gave them hope. A monk claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side. Whether true or not, it rekindled their courage. With renewed faith, the Crusaders burst forth from the gates and shattered their foes. Antioch was theirs, though bought at terrible cost. From there, the march south resumed. Dust rose beneath their feet, and the sun scorched their armor as they journeyed through strange lands, past towns that shimmered in the heat, past rivers that promised relief, but also danger. The Holy Land drew nearer with every weary step. At last, in June of 1099, the Crusaders beheld their prize, Jerusalem. The city gleamed upon its hill, surrounded by massive stone walls. Beyond those gates lay the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site of all, the place of Christ's death and resurrection. Tears filled the eyes of many. They fell to their knees, singing hymns, kissing the dry earth, convinced that they had come to the very heart of God's promise. But Jerusalem would not open its gates willingly. Its defenders stood ready, armed and resolute. The Crusaders, worn thin by years of marching and battle, prepared once more for siege. Wood was scarce in the dry hills, but they scoured the countryside, dragging timbers and planks to build towers and siege engines. Day after day they labored under the burning sun, fasting and praying as priests led processions around the walls. Then came the final assault. Great towers rolled forward, creaking and swaying as arrows rained down from the battlements. Ladders scraped against stone, men shouted and cursed, and the air filled with the clash of steel. Hours passed in chaos, until at last a breach was made. Crusaders poured into the city, swords flashing, voices crying, "Deus vult, God wills it." What followed was a storm of blood. The streets of Jerusalem ran red as the Crusaders cut down its defenders and inhabitants alike, Muslims, Jews, even Eastern Christians, caught in the path of fury. Chroniclers wrote of rivers of blood in the holy city, though their words may have mingled truth with horror. What is certain is that the conquest was merciless, a moment of triumph for the Crusaders, but one of terror and grief for those who lived within the walls. When at last the violence subsided, the Crusaders turned their steps to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Barefoot and weeping, they knelt before the altar, singing hymns of thanksgiving. For them, the journey was fulfilled. After years of struggle, Jerusalem was theirs. They had won not only a city, but also the belief that they had secured their souls. The conquest of Jerusalem marked the birth of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the crown jewel of the Crusader states. Alongside Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli, it stood as a fragile outpost of Christendom in the east. Castles were raised, rulers crowned, and knights sworn to defend the holy city. For a moment, it seemed that the cross had triumphed over the crescent. Yet even then shadows gathered. The conquest had left wounds that would not easily heal. Muslims and Jews across the region remembered the slaughter, while Byzantine rulers watched warily as these Western knights carved lands for themselves. The Crusaders had gained a kingdom, but they had also forged enemies that would not forget. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine the scene at Jerusalem's gates that summer of 1099. The air is thick with dust and smoke, the cries of battle fading into hymns of victory. Knights kneel on the stones, their armor battered, their faces streaked with sweat and blood, their eyes turned heavenward in prayer. The city glows in the twilight, its holy places now claimed by men who believed themselves chosen by God. The First Crusade had reached its blazing climax. But though Jerusalem had fallen, the story of the Crusades was far from over. For kingdoms must be defended, faith must be tested, and enemies once stirred do not rest quietly. The dream of the cross had been realized, but its price and its future had only just begun to unfold. Jerusalem had fallen, and with it, a new world was born. From the dust and blood of the First Crusade rose fragile kingdoms, outposts of Europe planted in the soil of the East. To the Crusaders, they were the reward for years of hardship. To the people who lived there, they were foreign powers, uncertain and uneasy neighbors. These realms became known as the Latin kingdoms of the East, their crown jewel the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself. Imagine it now, a patchwork of castles and towns, stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the hills of Judea, from Antioch in the north to Jerusalem in the south. At their heart stood Latin kings and princes, men who had once marched as pilgrims, but now ruled as lords. They built palaces and courts, they minted coins, and they placed their banners on ancient fortresses. Yet always they lived under the shadow of danger. For beyond their walls lay empires and armies that did not accept their presence. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was the grandest of them all, ruled first by Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the great leaders of the First Crusade. Humble and devout, he refused to be called king, taking instead the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. But soon, others would crown themselves monarchs, draping the holy city with the trappings of European royalty. Courts buzzed with knights and clerics, with laws written in both Latin and local tongues. The air was filled with the mingling of cultures, Western lords, Eastern Christians, Jews and Muslims living side by side, sometimes in tension, sometimes in uneasy peace. Castles rose across the land, great fortresses of stone like Crac des Chevaliers and Belvoir, built not only as homes for lords, but as shields against enemies. Their walls bristled with towers, their gates guarded by drawbridges and moats. From these strongholds, knights rode out to patrol the countryside, ever watchful for raids and rebellions. The castles were both symbols of dominance and reminders of fear, for the Crusaders knew they were few in number compared to the peoples who surrounded them. Among the most striking features of these kingdoms were the military orders that emerged to defend them. The Knights Templar, with their white mantles marked by a red cross, vowed poverty and chastity, yet wielded the sword with fierce devotion. They protected pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem and fought in battles with unshakable discipline. Alongside them were the Hospitallers, born first as caretakers of the sick, but soon hardened into warriors, their black mantles marked with white crosses. These orders became both guardians of the Holy Land and powerful forces in their own right, wealthy and feared. Life in the Latin kingdoms was not only war and watchfulness. In markets, spices from the east mingled with the bread and wine of Europe. Merchants from Venice and Genoa filled the harbors, bringing goods from across the seas. Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew voices echoed together in the streets, creating a chorus of languages that told of the world's mingling at these crossroads. Pilgrims continued to arrive, their journeys ending at the Holy Sepulchre, their footsteps guided by faith and longing. And yet beneath the bustle, danger simmered. Muslim leaders to the north and east watched with anger as the Crusaders settled into lands they considered stolen. Raids and skirmishes were constant, and the Latin lords often quarreled among themselves, their fragile unity cracking under the weight of pride. The dream of Jerusalem was a delicate thing, held together by castles and courage, but always at risk of shattering. Still, the Crusaders sought to root themselves in the soil of the East. Marriages were made between European lords and local Christian families. Laws were written that blended Frankish traditions with those of the Levant. Even the food and clothing began to change, as knights accustomed to cold northern lands learned to endure the heat of the Levantine sun. The Latin kingdoms were neither fully European nor fully Eastern. They were something in between, a fusion born of necessity and survival. The kingdom of Jerusalem stretched its hand over holy sites, Bethlehem, Nazareth, the Jordan River. Pilgrims knelt at shrines where Christ had once walked, weeping with joy that the land was in Christian hands once more. The rulers boasted of their victories, yet each sunrise brought the reminder that they lived encircled by powers far greater than themselves, and those powers were stirring. In the cities of Aleppo, Mosul, and Damascus, Muslim rulers plotted their return. At first they were divided, often at odds with one another, but slowly leaders arose who would dream of unity, of pushing the Crusaders back into the sea. The Latin kingdoms were strong in their castles, but their roots were shallow, and the winds of change already whispered across the desert sands. As night falls in your imagination, picture a Crusader castle on a hill. Torches burn along the walls, their flames flickering against the stone. Inside, knights dine on bread and wine, their swords resting by their sides. Beyond the walls, farmers till the fields, pilgrims pray in chapels, merchants count their coins. Yet always, on the horizon, there is the glow of campfires, armies waiting, watching, preparing. The Latin kingdoms were a fragile bridge between worlds, a dream made stone and steel. For a time they seemed to stand firm, basking in the glory of Jerusalem. But in the east a storm was gathering, a storm that would sweep across the land and test every stone, every sword, every vow. The Crusaders had gained their kingdoms, but holding them would prove a far greater trial. The Latin kingdom stood proud in the first decades after Jerusalem's fall. Their castles guarded the hills, their knights patrolled the roads, and pilgrims streamed through their gates with prayers of thanksgiving. For a time it seemed the Crusader dream might endure, but in the east, powers were stirring, and the fragile states born of the First Crusade soon found themselves under siege. The spark came in the city of Edessa, one of the earliest Crusader strongholds. It lay far to the north, exposed and isolated, surrounded by enemies. In 1144, the city's walls fell to the forces of Zengi, a fierce Muslim warlord of Mosul and Aleppo. His victory shocked the Crusaders, for Edessa was the first of their precious states to collapse. Its fall sent tremors through Christendom, reaching as far as the cathedrals and courts of Europe. The news was carried west by riders and priests, their words painting the disaster in dark hues. The Holy Land was in peril, they cried. If Edessa could fall, then Antioch, Tripoli, and even Jerusalem itself might be lost. Panic spread, and soon the call for a new crusade echoed through the churches of Europe. This time it was not only knights and lords who would answer. Two great kings took up the cross, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany. Their decision gave the Second Crusade a grandeur the First had not known, For now, crowned monarchs themselves would march east. Preachers fanned the flames of zeal, none more famous than Bernard of Clairvaux, a monk of fiery words whose sermons drew thousands to tears. He painted the crusade as a holy duty, a chance for redemption, and men across Europe once more stitched crosses to their cloaks. But even kings are not spared the hardships of pilgrimage. When Conrad and Louis led their armies into Anatolia, they faced hunger, disease, and the scorching sun. The Byzantine Empire, uneasy and mistrustful, offered little aid. The vast host of Germans, tired and disorganized, was ambushed by Turkish horsemen and broken upon the rocky hills. Survivors limped to the coast, their hopes in tatters. Louis and the French pressed on, but their march was no less difficult. Supplies dwindled, quarrels broke out, and the crusading spirit began to falter beneath the weight of exhaustion. When at last they reached the Holy Land, their numbers were thinned, their strength drained. Yet still, they turned their eyes toward their goal, Damascus. Damascus was one of the great cities of the East, rich in gardens and bazaars, its walls gleaming in the sun. It was also a city of great strategic value, for whoever held Damascus would hold a key to the defense of Jerusalem. The Crusaders resolved to take it. In the summer of 1148, the kings of France and Germany, along with the lords of Jerusalem, gathered their armies before Damascus. They marched through orchards heavy with fruit, through canals and streams that nourished the city's lush groves. For 4 days they laid siege, their tents rising like a forest around the walls. Arrows flew, ladders scraped against stone, and knights pressed forward with shouts of faith. But the city held firm, and within the Crusader camp, divisions festered. Some argued to attack from one side, others from another. Supplies ran short, and the defenders, emboldened, launched fierce counterattacks. Whispers of betrayal spread. Had some among the Crusaders turned to secret negotiations? In the end, confusion and mistrust unraveled the siege. After only a few days, the Crusaders abandoned their efforts, retreating in shame. The Second Crusade had ended in disaster. Edessa remained lost, Damascus still stood, and the great kings of Europe returned home in humiliation. The dream that had blazed so brightly under Bernard's sermons flickered and dimmed. For the Muslims of the region, the Crusaders no longer seemed invincible. For the Christians, doubt began to gnaw at the heart of their enterprise. Yet even in failure, the crusading spirit endured. Pilgrims continued to arrive, and the Latin kingdoms clung to life. Castles still bristled against the sky, knights still rode beneath the Red Cross, and prayers still rose in the Holy Sepulchre. But beyond their walls, leaders were rising who dreamed of unity, of driving the Crusaders into the sea. As you drift into rest, picture the scene at Damascus in those final hours. The orchards are trampled, the tents lie abandoned, the air heavy with the smell of dust and smoke. In the distance, the city's minarets rise above the groves, untouched, triumphant. Along the road, weary knights trudge away, their armor dented, their faces shadowed with defeat. They had come with kings with glory in their minds, and they left with sorrow in their hearts. The Second Crusade had shown that not every vow of faith would bring victory. It was a bitter lesson, one that would shape the battles yet to come. For soon, a new figure would rise in the East, a man whose name would echo across ages, Saladin. The failure of the Second Crusade left the Latin kingdoms weakened and uncertain. Their castles still dotted the hills, their banners still waved above Jerusalem, but the aura of invincibility had faded. For decades, Muslim rulers had been divided, each city and sultan ruling their own lands, often at odds with one another. Yet now, out of that shifting landscape, a new leader began to rise, a man who would embody the spirit of unity and faith, a man whose name would echo through history, Saladin. Born in 1137 in the city of Tikrit in Mesopotamia, Saladin, or Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, came from a Kurdish family of soldiers. As a boy, he was not thought destined for greatness. He was quiet, thoughtful, more interested in scholarship than war. He read poetry, studied the Quran, and absorbed the traditions of Islamic law. But the world around him was one of conflict, and as he grew, he was drawn into the service of his uncle, a general in the armies of Nur al-Din, the powerful ruler of Aleppo and Damascus. It was under Nur al-Din's guidance that Saladin first distinguished himself. He fought in campaigns across Syria and Egypt, showing not only skill with the sword, but also a talent for leadership. In time, he was appointed to command in Egypt, a land rich and vital, where rival dynasties had long contested power. By careful maneuvering and quiet strength, Saladin rose to prominence, until finally, when Nur al-Din died, he seized control of both Egypt and Syria. In this moment, Saladin became more than a general. He became the unifier of lands long divided. Where once Muslim rulers had quarreled and weakened one another, Saladin brought them together under his banner. His dream was greater than conquest. It was the vision of a united front that could resist and defeat the Crusaders who held Jerusalem. Saladin's character made him remarkable, not only to his own people, but even to his enemies. He was devout, often seen in prayer, generous to the poor and merciful to the defeated. Chroniclers tell of him refusing riches, preferring instead to spend his wealth on charity or on strengthening his armies. He was both warrior and saint in the eyes of many, and his reputation spread far beyond the lands he ruled. By the 1180s, Saladin's power was unmatched in the region. He commanded Egypt and Syria, he held the loyalty of countless tribes and soldiers, and his armies swelled with horsemen eager to fight. The Latin kingdoms, though still proud, were fragile in comparison. Their knights outnumbered, their lands stretched thin. The decisive moment came in 1187 at the Battle of Hattin. Near the shimmering waters of the Sea of Galilee, the Crusader army, led by King Guy of Jerusalem, marched under the burning July sun. Saladin's forces cut off their access to water, harrying them with arrows and fire. Exhaustion and thirst tore at the Crusaders until they were surrounded, their strength spent. On that day, the flower of Crusader nobility was destroyed. Knights fell in droves, banners toppled, and the true cross, the most sacred relic carried into battle, was seized by Saladin's men. King Guy himself was captured, along with many of his lords. Only the Templars and Hospitallers fought to the bitter end, and even they could not stem the tide. With the victory at Hattin, the road to Jerusalem lay open. One city after another surrendered to Saladin's advancing forces, and when he at last reached Jerusalem, the defenders knew they could not withstand him. Yet unlike the bloody conquest of 1099, when the Crusaders had taken the city in fire and slaughter, Saladin's entry was marked by mercy. He allowed many of the city's inhabitants to ransom themselves and leave in peace. The holy sites were restored to Muslim care, but Christians were not barred from pilgrimage. To his enemies he showed a grace that astonished the world. For the Crusaders, it was a moment of despair. The city they had marched so far to claim, the place they believed was the heart of their faith, was gone. Priests wept in cathedrals across Europe, kings and knights vowed vengeance, and once more the cry of crusade was raised. Yet even in their grief, many could not help but admire Saladin. His name was spoken with respect, even in the halls of his foes. To some he seemed a model of knightly virtue, a mirror of their own ideals, though born of another faith. In him the Crusades found not only an adversary, but a rival hero, one whose legend would endure as brightly as that of any European king. As you drift toward rest, picture that summer of 1187. The hills of Galilee shimmer under the sun, the air heavy with dust and smoke. Crusader banners lie crumpled in the dirt, their crosses trampled beneath hoof and sword. And beyond, Jerusalem gleams on its hill, its gates open to Saladin's triumphant army. Priests chant prayers, soldiers kneel in thanksgiving, and in the streets, life continues, now under a new master. The fall of Jerusalem to Saladin marked the turning point of the Crusades. The kingdoms carved by the sword of the West now trembled on the edge of collapse. But from Europe, across mountains and seas, kings were already gathering their armies once more. For they would not let Jerusalem go without a fight. The stage was set for one of the greatest confrontations of all, the meeting of Saladin with the lion-hearted King of England. The year was 1187, and the Christian world reeled from the loss of Jerusalem. News of Saladin's triumph at Hattin spread like wildfire across Europe, carried by pilgrims, priests, and envoys. churches filled with weeping congregations. Kings and nobles swore oaths before altars, vowing to reclaim the holy city at any cost. Out of this grief and fury was born the Third Crusade, perhaps the most famous of them all, led by kings whose names still shine in legend. Foremost among them was Richard I of England, known to history as the Lionheart. Fierce, fearless, and restless for glory, Richard embodied the knightly ideal. His sword was quick, his courage unshaken, and his appetite for battle insatiable. Alongside him stood Philip II of France, cunning and ambitious, and Frederick Barbarossa, the towering emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, whose red beard had become a symbol of strength. Three monarchs, three crowns, united under the cross. Europe stirred with preparation. Armies were raised, ships built, supplies gathered. From castles and towns across the continent, men sewed crosses to their tunics, their minds filled with visions of Jerusalem restored. Priests blessed them, families wept, and banners unfurled across the fields. It was said that never before had Christendom been so united in purpose. Yet even great kings cannot command fate. Frederick Barbarossa, marching overland through Anatolia, drowned suddenly while crossing a river. His death was a crushing blow, scattering his army, many of whom turned back in despair. The emperor who might have been the hammer of Saladin was gone, and the crusade lost one of its greatest leaders before it had even begun. Richard and Philip pressed on by sea, their fleet sailing south through the Mediterranean. Storms scattered their ships, and along the way, Richard found himself embroiled in disputes, capturing the island of Cyprus and planting his banner there. Though a delay, this conquest strengthened his hand, for Cyprus became a vital base for Crusader fleets in years to come. At last, Richard and Philip landed in the Holy Land, where the siege of Acre was underway. Acre, a vital port, had been held by Saladin's forces, and for months the Crusaders had struggled to take it. With the arrival of the kings, the siege turned fierce. Engines hurled stones, towers creaked forward, and the walls trembled beneath the assault. At last, the city fell, its gates thrown open to the Crusader armies. The victory was costly, and tensions quickly rose between Richard and Philip. Their alliance, forged in Europe, frayed beneath the heat of the East. Philip, weary and ill, soon returned to France, leaving Richard the Lionheart to face Saladin almost alone. Yet Richard thrived in this role. Bold and audacious, he led his men with a vigor that inspired awe. The clash between Richard and Saladin became the heart of the Third Crusade. At the Battle of Arsuf, near the coast, Saladin's cavalry swarmed around the Crusader columns, their arrows darkening the sky. For hours, the Crusaders marched under relentless assault, shields raised, discipline holding. At last Richard gave the signal. Knights lowered their lances, spurred their horses, and thundered into the enemy lines. The charge shattered Saladin's ranks, sending them fleeing across the plain. Arsuf was a triumph, and Richard's reputation as the Lionheart was sealed. Yet despite victories, Jerusalem eluded him. Twice Richard advanced toward the Holy City, and twice he turned back. The Crusader army, weary and dwindling, lacked the strength for a siege. Supplies ran thin, the land itself resisted them, and Saladin's forces shadowed their every move. Richard's courage was boundless, but even he could not conjure an army from dust. Instead, Richard and Saladin settled into a strange rivalry, one marked by both war and respect. Richard was bold, Saladin patient. They clashed in battles, but they also exchanged gifts. Saladin sent Richard fruit and horses when he fell ill. Richard praised Saladin's honor and restraint. Chroniclers tell of mutual admiration, of two great warriors recognizing in each other the mirror of their own greatness, though separated by faith. At last, in 1192, the two men agreed to peace. The Treaty of Jaffa allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem, though the city remained under Muslim control. It was not the victory the Crusaders had dreamed of, yet it was a compromise that preserved life and faith. Richard, his health failing, and his kingdom in peril back home, departed the Holy Land, never to return. The Third Crusade ended not with the conquest of Jerusalem, but with a stalemate, a draw written in blood and honor. To the Christians, it was a bittersweet outcome. The holy city remained beyond their grasp, but the dream of pilgrimage endured. To the Muslims, it was proof that Saladin had secured his triumph, keeping Jerusalem safe while showing mercy to his foes. As you drift toward sleep, imagine the final meeting of Richard and Saladin, not in person but in spirit. Two leaders separated by walls and distance, yet bound together by destiny. One, the lion heart, fierce and untamed. The other, Saladin, steady and devout. Their rivalry defined an age, their respect outlasting their battles. The Crusaders had not reclaimed Jerusalem, but the dream had not died. The cross still flew over Acre, pilgrims still walked to the sepulchre, and across Europe men still whispered of the holy city. The Third Crusade had written its chapter in glory and sorrow, but the story of the Crusades was far from finished. For soon, new crusades would rise, and with them, both triumph and tragedy beyond imagining. The Third Crusade had ended in a stalemate. Jerusalem remained under Saladin's heirs, but Christian pilgrims could still walk its streets, kneeling in prayer at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. For many in Europe, this compromise was not enough. The Holy City was still in Muslim hands, and the dream of Christendom's triumph burned unfulfilled. Thus once more the cry of crusade was raised, but what followed was not salvation for Jerusalem. Instead, it became one of the darkest and strangest turns in the history of the crusading movement. A crusade that never reached the Holy Land at all, but instead turned its swords against fellow Christians. The plan began in 1202. Ambitious nobles of France and Flanders pledged themselves to the cross. To reach the Holy Land, they needed ships, a fleet large enough to carry tens of thousands across the Mediterranean. For this, they turned to the masters of the sea, the merchants of Venice. The Venetians agreed to build a great fleet, but their price was high. When the time came, fewer crusaders arrived than expected, and they could not pay their full debt. The Venetians, shrewd and pragmatic, offered a bargain. If the Crusaders helped capture the Christian city of Zara, which had rebelled against Venetian control, the debt would be forgiven. It was a shocking proposal. Zara was not a Muslim stronghold, but a Christian city. Pope Innocent III condemned the plan, threatening excommunication. Yet hunger and desperation outweighed conscience, and the Crusaders agreed. Zara was besieged and taken, its walls battered, its citizens humbled beneath the swords of men who claimed to fight for Christ. Already the crusade had strayed from its purpose. From there the course bent even further. A Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, appeared before the Crusaders with an astonishing offer. His father had been dethroned in Constantinople, and he promised that if they helped him reclaim the throne, he would reward them with wealth, ships, and men for their journey to Jerusalem. The Crusaders, still burdened by debt and dazzled by the promise of gold, accepted. So it was that in 1203, the Crusader fleet sailed not to the shores of Palestine, but to the walls of Constantinople, the greatest Christian city of the East, the seat of the Byzantine Empire. Its domes glittered above the Bosporus, its towers rose high, its people prayed in Greek beneath the same god as the Crusaders. And yet, the Latin host arrayed itself for war. The first assault succeeded. The young Alexios was restored to power as co-emperor, but the promises he had made were too grand to fulfill. The people of Constantinople grew restless, angry at Latin soldiers striding through their streets, demanding gold and obedience. Tensions boiled, and soon the city erupted in rebellion. Alexios was deposed and killed, and the Crusaders, now betrayed and desperate, turned to vengeance. In April 1204, the Crusaders stormed Constantinople. Siege towers rolled forward, ladders clattered against the walls, and fires raged as gates fell. Once inside, discipline collapsed. For 3 days, the city was plundered. Churches were stripped of relics, their treasures carried west. The Hagia Sophia, jewel of Byzantine faith, was desecrated, its altar defiled, its walls echoing not with hymns, but with the shouts of soldiers and the cries of the fallen. The sack of Constantinople was a catastrophe. Not only had the Crusaders failed to reach Jerusalem, they had torn apart the greatest Christian city of the East. The Byzantine Empire was crippled, fractured into fragments. A new Latin Empire was declared, but it was fragile and resented. The gulf between Eastern and Western Christianity, already strained, now deepened into a wound that would never fully heal. For the Crusaders, the sack brought riches. Relics of saints were carried to the cathedrals of Europe, golden mosaics stripped from the Hagia Sophia, treasures paraded in triumph, but their victory rang hollow. The Pope himself, horrified by the destruction, lamented what had been done in the name of Christ. The Holy War had become a war of greed, and the dream of Jerusalem lay forgotten. Yet even in ruin, the story of the Fourth Crusade lingered in memory. Some saw it as proof of divine punishment, others as a lesson in the corruption of men. For the people of Constantinople, it was a scar that would endure for centuries, a reminder that the armies who had sworn to defend the faith had instead become its betrayers. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the city of Constantinople after the sack. The smoke of burned homes drifts above the domes, the once great streets littered with broken icons and scattered coins. In the Hagia Sophia, the flicker of candles reveals looted altars, while outside soldiers drag away carts laden with treasure. The bells toll faintly in the distance, not for triumph, but for mourning. The Fourth Crusade had begun with a dream of Jerusalem and ended with a wound to Christendom itself. The holy fire had been twisted into something darker, and the path of the Crusades would never again be quite the same. And yet, the cross still called. For even after this tragedy, new crusades would rise, drawn by the undying vision of Jerusalem, of salvation, of faith wrapped in steel. The Fourth Crusade had left Christendom shaken. Instead of Jerusalem, Constantinople had been taken and plundered, and the dream of a united Christian world was fractured. Yet, even in disillusionment, the idea of the crusade refused to die. The cross still beckoned, still stirred hearts with visions of holy triumph. Out of this enduring fire rose new expeditions, some tragic, some curious, and some born from the purest zeal, even if that zeal was misguided. Among the strangest and most haunting of these tales is the story of the Children's Crusade of 1212. Its truth is clouded by legend, but the echoes of what happened reveal the depth of the crusading spirit, even in the youngest of souls. It was said that in France and in Germany, boys no older than 12 and 13 began to preach that God had called them to free Jerusalem. They were not lords or knights, not soldiers hardened by war, but children, their eyes alight with innocent conviction. Thousands flocked to their banners, shepherds, peasants' sons, and village girls, all believing that where armed knights had failed, their purity of heart would succeed. They marched with crosses and songs, their feet blistered on the dusty roads, their voices lifted in hymns. Villagers stared in wonder as streams of children passed through towns, declaring that the seas would part before them, that miracles would clear their way to the Holy Land. But the world was not kind to innocence. Many starved along the roads, others were deceived by merchants and shipmasters. Some ships carrying the children were wrecked in storms. Others, it is said, carried them into slavery rather than to Jerusalem. Whether thousands truly marched or whether the tale grew in the telling, the Children's Crusade stands as a symbol of both faith and folly, of devotion so pure it was doomed in a harsh and unyielding world. Even as legends like these spread, new organized crusades took shape. In 1217, the Fifth Crusade set its sights not directly on Jerusalem but on Egypt, believing that controlling the Nile was the key to conquering the Holy Land. Armies from Germany, France, and the Papal States gathered, sailing to the rich delta of the Nile. They captured the port city of Damietta, a jewel on the river, but their triumph was fleeting. The Crusaders advanced deeper into Egypt, dreaming of Cairo, but the Nile itself rose against them. Seasonal floods turned the land into a trap, their army bogged down in mud and cut off from supplies. Surrounded, they were forced to surrender. The dream of victory dissolved once more, leaving Damietta returned to Egyptian hands. Not all crusades ended with such ruin. In the 1220s, the Sixth Crusade unfolded in a way unlike any before it, not with swords and bloodshed, but with words. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a man of learning as much as power, marched to the east after years of delay. Excommunicated by the Pope for his tardiness, he nonetheless pressed on, commanding his armies to Palestine. But instead of launching sieges, Frederick sought diplomacy. He negotiated directly with Muslim leaders, who by then were divided. Through careful bargaining, he secured an astonishing prize. Jerusalem itself returned to Christian rule without a single battle. For a brief and fragile moment, the cross once again flew over the holy city, not won by the clash of armies but by the stroke of pens. It was a strange victory, mistrusted by many. Some in Europe scorned Frederick for his friendship with Muslim scholars, for his willingness to treat them as equals. Yet for the pilgrims who once more entered Jerusalem's gates, kneeling at the Holy Sepulchre, the miracle was undeniable. Still, peace could not last. By the mid-13th century, war returned. The Seventh Crusade, led by Louis IX of France, sought once again to conquer Egypt. In 1249, his forces seized Damietta in triumph, but as before, the advance faltered. At the city of Mansoura, the Crusaders were trapped, their armies overwhelmed, their king himself captured. Only by ransom was Louis freed, retreating in sorrow, though still burning with zeal. Louis, undeterred, would try again in 1270, launching the Eighth Crusade, this time against the city of Tunis in North Africa. But there, death struck. Louis fell to illness, his crusade collapsing around him. His piety earned him sainthood, but his expeditions left little behind but broken armies and dashed hopes. As you drift deeper into rest, picture the strange mixture of glory and sorrow in these later crusades. Children walking barefoot with songs of faith, kings kneeling in defeat before foreign captors, emperors trading words instead of swords, cities briefly won and swiftly lost. Each crusade carried the same dream: Jerusalem restored, Christ's tomb in Christian hands. Yet again and again, reality dissolved that dream into dust and disappointment. And yet, the crusading spirit endured. In castles across Europe, knights still vowed to take the cross. In churches, priests still preached the holy war. In villages, peasants still whispered of salvation promised to those who marched east. The Crusades had become more than wars. They were an idea, a longing woven into the soul of Christendom, even as each failure made that longing harder to grasp. Picture now the roads of France or Germany in those years. Pilgrims and crusaders march side by side, one carrying a staff, the other a sword. Children sing, merchants haggle, priests lift the cross high above the crowd. Hope mingles with sorrow, devotion with doubt. The road stretches endlessly eastward, across mountains and seas, toward a city that glimmers like a vision but always seems to slip from their grasp. The later Crusades were not triumphs of steel, but reflections of human yearning, for salvation, for victory, for a world made holy. And though they failed again and again, the story did not end. For beyond the horizon, Jerusalem still called, and Christendom still dreamed of reclaiming it. The crusading spirit, though battered by failure and betrayal, refused to die. Again and again, the cross was lifted high, and men and women looked eastward with longing. By the early 13th century, the dream of Jerusalem remained vivid, but the Crusaders sought new strategies. If the holy city could not be taken directly, perhaps the path to it lay through Egypt, the rich and powerful heart of the Muslim world. Thus was born the Fifth Crusade, proclaimed in 1217. From across Europe came armies of Germans, Hungarians, and Italians, joined later by French forces. Their leaders believed that Egypt held the key. Strike there, and the Muslim powers would falter, leaving Jerusalem vulnerable. The Crusaders set their sights on Damietta, a port city at the mouth of the Nile. Damietta was a jewel of Egypt, its walls strong, its harbor bristling with defenses. Yet the Crusaders came prepared. Siege towers rolled against the gates, engines hurled stones, and ships blockaded the river. For months the battle raged, hunger and disease gnawing at both sides. Finally, in 1219, the city fell. Damietta was theirs. In the flush of victory, many believed the Crusades' goal was within reach. From Damietta, the road to Cairo lay open. If Cairo could be taken, the entire Muslim world might bend. But caution gave way to overconfidence. The Crusaders advanced along the Nile, their army burdened by the heat and the river's treacherous floods. The Egyptian defenders, patient and cunning, let the land itself become their ally. Canals were opened, fields flooded, and soon the Crusader army was trapped in a watery maze. Supplies dwindled, morale broke, and at last surrender was their only choice. Damietta, the prize so dearly won, was handed back. The Crusaders departed in defeat, their hopes drowned in the waters of the Nile. The Fifth Crusade had promised glory, but delivered only shame. Yet even in failure, the idea of crusade endured. Just a few years later, in 1228, a new expedition set sail, led by one of the most remarkable figures of the age, Emperor Frederick II, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire. Unlike the fiery knights of old, Frederick was a man of learning, a patron of science and philosophy, fluent in Arabic as well as Latin. His mind was as sharp as his sword, and his ambitions reached far beyond the battlefield. His crusade, the Sixth Crusade, was unlike any that had come before. Excommunicated by the Pope for delays and disputes, Frederick nonetheless sailed to the Holy Land, determined to achieve what others had failed to grasp. But instead of launching sieges and battles, he turned to diplomacy. In the courts of the Ayyubid rulers, Saladin's heirs, Frederick found men who, like him, valued reason as well as faith. Through careful negotiation, he secured what armies had bled for and never gained, Jerusalem itself. In 1229, by treaty, the city was ceded to Christian control, its holy sites restored, its gates opened to pilgrims once more. It was a triumph without bloodshed, a miracle wrought not by swords but by words. For the first time since Saladin's victory, Christians knelt again in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre under their own banners. Pilgrims wept in joy, knights sang hymns, and Frederick crowned himself King of Jerusalem in a city that had returned to Christian hands without a single clash of steel. And yet, even this remarkable victory was shadowed by doubt. The Pope, still at odds with Frederick, refused to bless his achievement. Many knights scorned the peace, calling it hollow, for Jerusalem's walls were weak, its defenses uncertain. Within a decade, Muslim forces returned and retook the city, leaving the Crusaders with only memories of their brief triumph. Still, the Sixth Crusade showed that the dream of Jerusalem could be pursued in more ways than one. Not every victory was written in fire and blood. Some could be carved from the fragile paths of diplomacy. Frederick, though controversial, had proven that the crusading spirit could adapt, even if the results were fleeting. As you close your eyes, imagine the city of Jerusalem in 1229. The bells of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre toll in the clear air, their sound mingling with the call to prayer from distant minarets. Pilgrims kneel in the streets, kissing the stones, tears streaming down their faces as they touch the places where Christ once walked. No battle scars the city this time. Its gates open quietly, as though a miracle has passed through. But miracles are fragile, and history seldom pauses in peace. The Nile still flowed in Egypt, strong and eternal, and Muslim armies still gathered in the east. The Fifth and Sixth Crusades had brought fleeting victories and bitter losses, but they had not secured the dream. Jerusalem remained uncertain, its fate tied to the shifting tides of power. And so the story moved forward. New kings would take up the cross. New armies would march to Egypt and beyond. Among them would be one of the most pious rulers in all of Europe, a man who would give his life to the cause, Louis the Maine of France. The memory of Frederick II's peaceful triumph in Jerusalem lingered only briefly. By the mid-13th century, the Holy City was once again in Muslim hands, its walls guarded, its gates closed to the armies of Christendom. Yet the fire of the crusade did not fade. Across Europe, kings and nobles still dreamed of reclaiming the land of Christ, and among them stood one man whose devotion to the cause was unmatched, Louis IX of France. Louis was not only a king but also a saintly figure in his own time, pious and devout beyond measure. He fasted, prayed, and built churches, ruling his people with a sense of sacred duty. To Louis, the crusade was not merely a war, but a holy calling, the very purpose of his reign. When Jerusalem fell once more in 1244, his heart was pierced with grief. He vowed then and there to take up the cross and lead his people eastward. His destination was not Jerusalem itself, but Egypt. Like the leaders of the Fifth Crusade before him, Louis believed that striking at Egypt, the wealthiest and most powerful land of the Muslim world, would open the way to the Holy Land. In 1248, his fleet set sail, carrying knights, priests and soldiers across the Mediterranean. The Seventh Crusade had begun. The first blows fell at Damietta, that stubborn port city at the mouth of the Nile. When Louis and his forces landed, they expected a long siege, but fortune smiled upon them. But in the narrow streets the tide turned. The Mamluks, swift and cunning, counterattacked. Chaos erupted, knights fell, and the Crusader army broke apart. What followed was ruin. Louis and his men, trapped along the Nile, were cut off from supplies. Hunger gnawed, disease spread, and the once proud army dwindled. At last, surrounded and helpless, Louis surrendered. The King of France himself was taken prisoner, held captive by the very foes he had come to conquer. In France the news struck like thunder. Their king, a saintly warrior, was in chains in a foreign land. But Louis bore his captivity with dignity, praying constantly, comforting his fellow captives, and waiting patiently for God's will to unfold. In time a ransom was arranged, a staggering sum of gold, along with the surrender of Damietta. Only then was Louis freed, his crusade in tatters, his dreams unfulfilled. And yet, he did not abandon his vow. For Louis, the crusade was not measured in victories or defeats, but in faith. As you drift deeper into rest, picture the scene of Louis in captivity. The great king, clad not in golden robes but in the plain garb of a prisoner, kneels on the hard floor of a tent. His lips move in prayer, his eyes steady, unshaken by fear. Around him, his knights murmur in sorrow, their chains clinking softly in the night. Outside, the Nile flows on, indifferent, eternal, carrying whispers of battles won and lost. Yet Louis, King of France, returned home not broken but steadfast. To him, failure was not the end, only a test of faith. He believed God had chosen him for this sacred mission, and so he would try again. 2 decades later, when the call of crusade rose once more, Louis answered. Older now, but no less devout, he gathered his banners, raised his armies, and prepared to march. This time, however, his eyes turned not to Egypt directly, nor to Jerusalem, but to North Africa. In 1270, he launched the 8th Crusade, landing near the city of Tunis, believing it could serve as a new base for Christendom. a stepping stone to Egypt and the Holy Land beyond. The sun was merciless, the air heavy with dust and heat. Crusader tents dotted the fields outside Tunis, their banners fluttering in the searing wind. Louis prayed, fasted, and encouraged his men, determined that this expedition would succeed where others had faltered. But destiny had other plans. Disease swept through the camp, dysentery, fever, and plague. Soldiers fell by the hundreds, and soon even the king himself was stricken. In the summer of 1270, Louis IX lay dying beneath the blazing North African sun. Surrounded by priests and knights, he whispered prayers until the end, his last words said to be, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem." For him, the city had been the heart of his reign, the dream of his life, a dream he carried to his final breath. With his death, the Eighth Crusade dissolved. His son and heir returned to France, leaving behind little more than a memory of devotion and loss. Louis would be canonized as a saint, remembered for his piety and sacrifice. But his crusades, like so many before them, left no lasting gains in the East. Meanwhile, the Latin kingdoms themselves stood on the edge of ruin. For nearly 2 centuries they had survived, fragile enclaves clinging to the coasts of the Levant. Their castles still loomed, their ports still welcomed pilgrims and merchants, but their strength was waning. The Muslim powers, now united under the fierce rule of the Mamluks of Egypt, pressed ever harder. One by one, the Crusader outposts fell. Cities that had once glittered with Western banners now bowed to new masters. In 1268, Antioch, proud capital of the north, was stormed and destroyed. Its walls crumbled, its people slaughtered, its glory extinguished in a single brutal campaign. The shock of Antioch's fall reverberated through Europe. Pilgrims wept, preachers raged, but no great host came to its rescue. The age of mass crusades was fading, leaving the Crusader states to stand alone. The final blow came in 1291. On the shores of the Mediterranean stood the city of Acre, last stronghold of the Crusaders, the jewel of their dwindling kingdom. Its walls were mighty, its harbors filled with ships, its streets alive with merchants from Italy, France, and beyond. But the Mamluks gathered in vast numbers, their army like a tide poised to sweep the city away. For weeks the siege raged. Siege towers rolled, catapults hurled stones, and the walls trembled under the assault. Knights of the Temple and Hospitallers fought with desperate courage, their crosses gleaming in the smoke, their swords flashing in the dust. Women carried water to the battlements, children huddled in the churches, priests lifted the cross high and prayed for deliverance. But the enemy was too strong. In May 1291, the walls were breached, and Acre fell in fire and blood. The last defenders fought to the end, refusing surrender, while ships crammed with refugees fled across the sea. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem was no more. The dream born in 1099 at the first capture of Jerusalem ended nearly 2 centuries later in the smoke of Acre. From that day forward, the Crusaders held no great cities in the Holy Land. The castles of the coast were abandoned, their stones left to crumble beneath the sun. Yet even in loss the memory endured. Pilgrims still longed for Jerusalem, poets still sang of knights and kings, and the cross still glowed in the imagination of Christendom. The Crusades had left behind not just ruins, but legends, scars, and echoes that would shape centuries to come. The smoke of Acre drifted slowly out to sea, carrying with it the last embers of the Crusader kingdoms. The walls lay in ruins, the banners torn down, and the knights who had sworn to guard the Holy Land had either perished or sailed west in sorrow. The age of Crusader outposts in the Levant had ended, but the story of the Crusades did not vanish with the fall of Acre. Their echoes carried across centuries, leaving behind a legacy both bright and dark, filled with inspiration and caution alike. For the West, the Crusades had been more than battles. They were pilgrimages, woven with faith and blood, driven by hope and desperation. Thousands of men and women had crossed seas and deserts, carrying crosses on their cloaks and prayers in their hearts. Some found glory, others found death, but all became part of a great tide that reshaped the medieval world. In Europe, the Crusades strengthened the power of kings. Monarchs who had once been rivals learned to rally their peoples under a single banner, uniting nobles, knights and peasants in a common cause. Taxes were raised, armies organized, fleets built, all in the name of Jerusalem. Though the dream often ended in disappointment, the machinery of power that arose in these campaigns remained, giving birth to stronger states and more centralized realms. Trade too blossomed. Ships that carried crusaders across the sea returned laden with spices, silks, and treasures from the east. The ports of Venice, Genoa, and Pisa grew wealthy, their merchants navigating not only the waters of the Mediterranean, but also the pathways of diplomacy and war. The markets of Europe filled with goods once rare and wondrous: pepper, sugar, glassware, and fine cloth. In the wake of Crusade, commerce flowed like a river, binding east and west together, even as armies clashed. Ideas crossed as well. From Arab scholars came works of medicine, astronomy, and philosophy, translated into Latin and studied in Europe's growing universities. The number zero, the art of algebra, and the teachings of Aristotle traveled westward, changing the way men thought about the world. The Crusades were wars, but they were also bridges, harsh, blood-stained bridges, yet bridges nonetheless. But their legacy was not only of learning and trade. There was also bitterness, mistrust, and violence. The Crusaders had marched not only against Muslims, but also against Jews, whose communities in Europe suffered pogroms as armies prepared to depart. In Constantinople, once a proud ally, the Crusaders had turned their fury inward, sacking the city in 1204 and leaving scars that never healed. For the Byzantine Empire, the Fourth Crusade was not salvation, but ruin. The rift between East and West deepened, a wound that would remain long after the last Crusader had sailed away. In the Muslim world, the memory of the Crusades was also profound. For generations, cities like Jerusalem, Damascus, and Cairo had stood at the center of holy war, their people resisting waves of invaders from faraway lands. Leaders such as Saladin and the Mamluks became symbols of resistance, uniting diverse peoples under the banner of jihad. The Crusaders, once seen as fierce conquerors, came in time to be viewed as temporary interlopers, destined to vanish like the tide. Yet the struggle they brought left stories and scars that shaped Muslim memory for centuries to come. Spiritually, the Crusades left paradoxes. They were born of faith, called in the name of God, yet they often descended into cruelty. The slaughter of Jerusalem in 1099, the burning of villages, the plundering of Constantinople. To some, they were acts of devotion. To others, they were sins dressed as sanctity. Pilgrims kissed the stones of Calvary, even as knights spilled blood upon them. The Crusades revealed the heights and depths of human devotion, showing how zeal could inspire both charity and atrocity. And yet, even in their contradictions, the Crusades left behind a sense of shared imagination. Ballads and chronicles filled with tales of knights, saints, and kings spread across Europe. The stories of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin were told not only as histories, but as legends, shaping ideals of chivalry and honor. The very word crusade would live on, used in ages far beyond the Middle Ages to mean any great cause, any desperate struggle for a dream. As you drift deeper into sleep, imagine the echoes of the Crusades across the centuries. A Venetian ship returning from the Levant, its hold filled with spices that will flavor a noble's feast. A scholar in Paris reading an Arabic text on medicine, his candle flickering as new ideas take root in his mind. A poet in England singing of knights in shining armor, his audience listening with wonder, their hearts carried eastward by the rhythm of the tale. The battles themselves have faded, the castles crumbled, the banners turned to dust, but the legacy endures. in the languages we speak, the foods we eat, the sciences we study, and the stories we tell. The Crusades were not just wars of stone and steel. They were currents that shifted the flow of history, pushing civilizations into contact, conflict, and change. And so the tale moves toward its close. For though the Crusaders no longer hold Jerusalem, and the last of their outposts lie in ruins, their story lives on not only in chronicles of kings and monks, but in the shared memory of East and West. Soon we will arrive at the final chapter, where we will reflect on the twilight of crusading, on what these centuries of war and pilgrimage meant for those who lived them, and for us who look back across time. The year 1291 marked the fall of Acre, the last great bastion of the Crusaders in the Holy Land. Its towers tumbled, its walls were torn down, and the survivors fled westward across the sea. The age that had begun with the thunderous charge into Jerusalem in 1099 seemed at last to be over. Yet the spirit of crusading lingered, flickering in new forms, reshaped by the passing of centuries. In the decades after Acre's fall, Christendom still dreamed of holy war. Popes continued to preach new campaigns, their voices calling knights to take up the cross once more. Plans were drawn for fresh expeditions to the east, and embassies were sent to distant lands in hopes of alliances, even to the Mongols, whose thunderous armies once swept across the steppes. For a time there was hope that these horsemen might ride with the cross against Islam, but those hopes came to nothing. Instead, the crusading spirit found new battlefields. In Spain, Christian kingdoms pressed southward, reclaiming lands held for centuries by Muslim rulers. This Reconquista, though separate from the Crusades of the Levant, carried the same language, the same sense of holy struggle. Cities like Córdoba, Seville, and Granada became stages for a centuries-long campaign that ended only in 1492, with the fall of the last Muslim kingdom in Iberia. To the north, in the Baltic lands, Crusaders turned their swords against pagan peoples, bringing Christianity by force to the forests of Prussia, Lithuania, and Livonia. The Teutonic Knights, who had once defended castles in the Holy Land, now raised their banners against new foes. These wars too were called Crusades, echoes of Jerusalem resounding in distant lands. Even beyond Europe, the dream of Jerusalem did not die. Adventurers, poets, and pilgrims still spoke of the holy city, still longed for its gates. The word crusade came to mean not only war in the East, but any great endeavor, any struggle for a cause thought righteous. The legacy of the first Crusaders stretched far beyond their age, shaping the way people thought about faith, conflict, and purpose. But as the centuries passed, the failures of the Crusades grew clearer. The bloodshed at Jerusalem, the sacking of Constantinople, the rivers of lives lost in Egypt and on the Nile, these became reminders of zeal turned to violence. The rift between East and West, between Latin and Greek, deepened and hardened, never fully healed. For the Muslim world, the Crusaders became a memory of invasion, a reminder of strangers who came with swords and banners, claiming holy purpose. Still, not all was darkness. Through crusade, cultures had touched and mingled. Ideas had crossed oceans and deserts, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Trade routes flourished, bringing spices, silks, and knowledge to Europe. The very spark that would one day ignite the Renaissance had, in part, been carried home by crusaders, merchants, and pilgrims alike. The twilight of crusading was not a single moment, but a slow fading of a flame. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the grand expeditions to the Holy Land were no more. Instead, smaller campaigns, local wars, and shifting ambitions replaced the dream of Jerusalem. When Constantinople itself fell in 1453, not to crusaders but to the rising power of the Ottomans, the last flicker of the old age was extinguished. The East and West would meet again, but in new struggles, under new banners, in a world forever changed. As you settle deeper into rest, picture the journey of crusading not as a single road, but as a long, winding river. At its source was faith, fierce, raw, unyielding. Along its banks grew castles, cities, and kingdoms, fragile yet proud. Into its waters poured blood, dreams, and prayers, carried across generations. And finally, as the river reached the sea, its currents scattered, flowing into new lands, shaping distant futures in ways its first pilgrims could never have imagined. The Crusades had been wars, pilgrimages, and legends. They had shown humanity's heights of devotion and depths of cruelty, its longing for the divine and its weakness for ambition. They were not victories to be celebrated, nor failures to be scorned, but mirrors of what men and women can become when hope and fear intertwine. Tonight, as you fall into sleep, imagine the ruins of Acre bathed in moonlight. The sea whispers against its stones, the voices of knights and pilgrims long gone. Above, the stars shine as they did when the first Crusaders marched, when kings and monks prayed, when Saladin dreamed of Jerusalem. Those same stars shine now upon us, distant but eternal. The story of the Crusades is finished, yet its echoes live on, in memory, in legend, and in the lessons it leaves behind. And as you drift into dreams, let the final thought be one of peace, for the wars of the past are but shadows, while the light of understanding can guide us still.